Lisa from AIM.
Thanks, Christine. Hi, everybody. I'm Lisa. I'm the Director of Association of Museums, AIM. And just here really to say a quick hello and thank you very much for coming. Especially, we may have a couple of people who joined us for the first session on this research, which was a really lively and an interesting one. And we will be covering different ground because it is such an exciting report with so much information in it. We were really pleased to be able to join with Art Fund to do this research, which we think is very much exciting and brings something new to the sector in terms of thinking about how to engage with audiences. And we know that everybody loves museums, and people have in many cases very deep emotional connections going back to their childhoods, to their parents, to grandparents, and it's something that we just kind of let happen. And the idea behind this research was really to understand more about that and how museums and heritage organisations can really build that feeling so that when it's needed, for instance, when museums are threatened or have funding difficulties, that support in the community is there. So I hope everybody finds this session useful. Do ask questions and think about how it might apply to you and your organisation. And yeah, hope it's a good one for everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And now we're just going to hear from Lucy from Art Fund as well.
Hi everyone, lovely to meet you. As Christine said, I'm Lucy from Art Fund and I am the policy manager. And from an Art Fund perspective, when we first got involved in this piece of research, we were reflecting a lot on the pandemic and how many of us probably took for granted the amazing role that museums play in our emotional well-being. So from this, as Lisa was mentioning, we were so keen to think about how we can engage people's hearts as well as their minds. And we know this really struck a chord in the pandemic. And now looking forward, we're really trying to think about how we can galvanize all these emotions to kind of bring people together to support museums longer term. So that's something we're really interested to hear about today. And I know Elliot's going to touch on that. So we're looking forward to hearing about those recommendations and also hearing from yourselves about ways you think you might be using the research and your plans for perhaps implementing or considering some of it in your future goals and work. So it would be fantastic to hear a bit about that too at the end. So really looking forward to the session, and yeah, please do keep hold of questions and let us know any thoughts or feedback as we go.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Lucy. And now I'm going to hand over to Elliot, one of our researchers, who will talk us through the session today.
Brilliant. Just to fact, Christine, I think last time we had questions going through, but we answered them at the end. Is that the expectation?
Yeah, so if you want to pop any questions in the chat, we'll keep those to the end, just in case, if you want to make a note of them in case you forget them as we go along.
Okay, I'm hoping everyone can see that. If someone could just give me a yes and then I can move forward.
Yeah, all good.
Perfect. Brilliant. So hi everyone, and again thank you for joining us today. So my name's Elliot from M.E.L Research, and I worked alongside M.E.L Royal on this study. M.E.L is a freelance researcher as well as working for the V&A's Insight team. Unfortunately, she can't be with us today because she's sick, but she was a major contributor, so I just wanted to flag that. So M.E.L were asked by AIM and Art Fund to investigate the emotional drivers behind the public's motivation to support museums, and this is the second of two webinars, as has been referenced, and is really kind of a top line overview of what is in the report. I would encourage you all to read the report if this does kind of twig your interest. The first webinar was by M.E.L a month ago, introducing what we'd done, why and what we'd found. I will recap on some of that today because it's important context for the rest. And this is the second webinar, and we'll cover kind of some examples, ideas for using the findings, those types of things. It is worth saying there's a lot in the report, and this session is much more focused on museums, rather than sector support organisations or other, IPSOs, those types of things. There is There is elements that cover those organisations in the report as well, but this is a museum-focused webinar. So a quick kind of roadmap. We're going to quickly recover the challenge and what we did, our approach. We're going to recap on what we actually discovered and just quickly walk over the model again. And then I'm going to walk through, how you would use it, understanding your current positioning, how you might use emotions in campaigns and some examples of that, and then how you might use emotions in programming and bring those in more, and again, some examples of that. And at the end, we're going to talk about moving forward. Just so you know, the link to the report is there. It's just a short one. It will take you to AIM's website, not M.E.L's, but it's just a kind of a quick way of getting there if you wanted to kind of find it immediately. So Art Fund and AIM, as has been referenced by Lisa and Lucy, have both been interested in building connections between audiences and museums for some time. I think, however, the pandemic was in some ways the catalyst for this specific study. It showed both the potential vulnerability of small museums, but also demonstrated the connections that audiences have to them and the extent to which people were willing to support museums financially or with their time or their support through campaigning, volunteering, those types of things during the pandemic. What we wanted to understand was, is there something we can learn from that kind of episode, that will help the sector better leverage emotions more regularly and with more people, so that we're building resilience and these kinds of interaction aren't necessarily limited to times of crisis. The broad premise is really that visitors make a choice to invest their attention, their time, and in some cases their money in museums. Our sector is definitely on the front foot when it comes to evoking emotions in our audiences. You can do, these are just some kind of TripAdvisor reviews, and a lot of them will mention emotions. I'm not going to read them out in full, we probably haven't got the time. But you only need to skim TripAdvisor reviews to see how visitors emotionally connect with museum experiences. They can inspire awe, they can help contextualise our place in history, they can connect us to people we've never even met before, and they can inspire hope for the future. So building on that point, our challenge from AIM and Art Fund was to uncover the emotional drivers behind the public support for the museum sector. Which emotions played the strongest role in driving support? Were some more effective than others? Were some emotions better to invoke kind of short-term support if you were campaigning or if you needed immediate help? Were others better to help sustain support and a real connection over the long term or the lifetime of a visitor? To get at this, we undertook a largely qualitative approach. So qualitative is kind of the touchy-feely, the emotions, less numbers. And so from a long list of museums who had received significant support from the public, we identified a short list of 7 organisations who took part. The rationale for inclusion is detailed in detail in the report, but suffice to say they'd all recently been involved in public campaigns or an in-depth engagement with the public of some sort. We interviewed staff across all of these museums and also asked them to put us in touch with what we call community leaders for each of their campaigns. So these were members of the public, not museum staff, from the museum's local community generally, but potentially also a community of interest in some cases, who played a pivotal role in helping the museum communicate their campaign to the public. So for some museums, these were volunteers, they might have been part of friends associations, some were trustees, some had just started petitions on the museum's behalf, some were just members of the public who particularly cared about the museum in question and were kind of campaigning for it on social media, those types of things. So we spoke to leadership and staff from museums, we then spoke to those community leaders, and we also ran an online research community with members of the public over the course of a week, and all those members of the public were museum supporters as well, but from across the whole of the UK, not just centred on these 7 museums. So we've got a real kind of range of experiences. And then finally, we conducted a survey across the sector. The key point really is that everyone we spoke to was already a museum supporter. We wanted to find out why they were and what emotions museums stirred in them. So what did we find out? All of that generated hours and hours of audio and video and thousands of words of text, which we analysed and which effectively told us that museums invoke a huge range of emotions and feelings in people. Some were light, fleeting emotions, such as feeling kind of entertained or excited, while others were deeper, more impactful, more long-term emotions like hope, empowerment, important, feeling important in yourself. we kind of felt that producing a report which just detailed this list of 200 different emotions would be unwieldy to read and arguably quite unhelpful. So we focused on understanding the themes that came out and how different types of emotions were connected to different levels of engagement with museums and different outcomes in terms of the support those who felt them gave. And what we found was that this kind of huge number of emotions could usefully be grouped into 3 overarching sets, which we called feelings. So all of the emotions within a feeling group contribute to giving audiences a sense of either purpose, the red triangle, connection, or pleasure. Within each feeling, we then identified 3 archetypal emotions, which best illustrate the breadth of all the emotions within that group, and which are different enough from each other so as to be meaningful, and having only 3 of them, 9 in total, is useful on a practical level. We also discovered that these emotions varied in prevalence, in intensity, and most importantly, played a different role in shaping people's decision making. So in kind of Maslow style, true Maslow style, we've created a pyramid of our own, and this is our model for mapping emotional drivers for how people engage with museums. So to walk through each of those quite briefly. So at the bottom of the pyramid sit our feelings of pleasure. Museums definitely create pleasurable emotions in people. They're places to have fun, somewhere we go to feel relaxed, somewhere we go to feel amused, amazed, entertained, somewhere to feel happy or to quench your curiosity. These are the emotions that repeatedly came up again and again in our interviews, and especially in our research community with the general public. They were by far the most prevalent emotions that people associate with museums, were the easiest for museums to foster, and frankly, most visitors would be hard pressed not to feel at least one pleasurable emotion as a result of engaging with a museum. However, whilst they were very commonplace, they're fairly fleeting. Visitors might feel them in the moment as they walk around a museum or in the immediate kind of afterglow of a visit, but these aren't the type of emotions that follow you home, and it's difficult to sustain them in the long term and to build on them to kind of generate longer term support from an individual, and they're not strongly linked to behaviour change in terms of museum support. At the middle level, we have the emotions that make us feel connected. We found lots of different ways in which museums can make people feel emotionally connected. They can make us feel connected to ourselves and our identity, to our friends and family, our neighbours, our communities, but also to our heritage, to history, so including people from the past, but also history more broadly in our sense of kind of development, I guess, and our sense of place, connection to our sense of place. We found these emotions were felt more strongly than the more fleeting pleasurable emotions. People enjoy to feel connected, they enjoy feeling understood and relevant to other people. Those who valued and supported museums often did so because they felt a sense of ownership or nostalgia for either their memories of this museum specifically, or a specific exhibit or artifact, or their memories of a bygone time, and also feelings of belonging and acceptance in that space. Many also valued museums as vehicles which could bind together their local community and act as, a unifier, a safe space for everyone and anyone to participate in. Actually, one of my favourite quotes from the study was related to connection, and its relevance might not sound like an emotion until you have felt irrelevant. I just think it was kind of a really powerful summary of this idea of connection. In terms of building these feelings, they're less easy to build, but by no means impossible. It can be fostered. They do rely on museums to build links to other people, to organisations and communities, which was happening in some museums, but not others. And I'll give some examples of building connection later on. Finally, we have feelings of purpose. This category includes some often quite intangible or difficult to pin down emotions, so feeling empowered, feeling dutiful, those types of things. We found that museums evoke emotions in people that grant them a sense of agency over their own lives and allow them to feel like they're doing something beneficial and meaningful. That might be beneficial for them. For instance, they feel knowledgeable, by improving their knowledge about a particular subject or doing a specific task or volunteering might build their self-confidence. It gives them a purpose, but it might also be beneficial for other people. Many of the community leaders we spoke to had worked kind of tirelessly in support of their favourite museum, had dedicated their time, energy, and again money because they felt it was the right thing to do. Quote, fostering emotions of purpose is difficult because it's often about finding alignment with someone's worldview or their deeply held beliefs. So by definition, it's unlikely that you're going to engage, large swathes of your audience in this way. But those you do engage and do connect with on a purposeful level are likely to be more strongly invested in your museum and moving forward. So just to conclude the kind of recap, these are the 9 emotions we've referred to in the report as the building blocks of emotionally resonant campaigns. The goal is for you as museums and heritage organisations to be able to use these 9 emotions to create, I guess, the John Lewis Christmas ad of the museum world, and to be able to make the case for support, not only by stating all the logical and rational reasons why you might need the public's help. Obviously, heating costs at the moment is an obvious one, but instead using these themes and the 9 emotions to focus the messaging and positioning of your campaigns on something that has more of an emotional pull. It is really important before I move on to talk about some examples of where this is happening and how you might actually use it practically, that we know this is happening. Obviously, we've interviewed museums who are already doing this. That's how we've got this data. And I'm not here to teach your comms and programming team how to suck eggs. The hope really is that by providing a structure or a framework for this, will just help bring it to the front a bit more when we're thinking about how we do these things. And also, it's a starting point. This can develop and improve based on feedback, and we'll talk about more on that at the end. So we broadly know the model. How do we figure out where we currently are so we can start using it? This is something that was asked about in the last webinar, so I'm going to cover it in a bit more detail here and just give you some ideas for how you might start to get a sense of where your museum sits. So one approach is definitely to think about it from your own perspective. What do you think you're doing? What are you trying to do? Are you actually trying to do it, or is it just kind of happening naturally? List all the ways in which you think that your museum, your permanent collection, your exhibitions, your projects, your outreach, your learning programs, any way you interact with people, how do you think your museum makes your audience feel different emotions? If you need inspiration for this, pages 11 to 13 of the report contain a longer list of emotions than the 9 we've focused on for the model. So you can kind of, we would just say, think about all of your programming and just think about the emotions you'd expect it to make people feel. Once you've got them, ask yourself how that long list of emotions you've got broadly align to the 3 feelings. Are you mostly generating pleasure, or do you think you're hitting some emotions which might sit in connection or purpose? So that's kind of your perspective. Next, I would really encourage you to think about what you already have. What we don't want to do is sit here and kind of tell people that everyone must do a large-scale visitor survey or audience research piece. It'd be great for M.E.L, but it's not what we're here to do. I originally called this existing data, but I actually think that can put people off as it sounds like numbers and it sounds quite technical. What we really want here is probably words. So think about feedback you've got on TripAdvisor. Are there exhibition reviews in local papers or visit write-ups in blogs? Just search your museum plus review or your museum plus blog on Google and see what comes up. What are people posting about you on social media? What are people posting about you on the web? If you have any evaluations you've done, whether that's internal, whether it's part of a funded project, did they include any qualitative research? Do they have any quotes in them? Do you have any comments? Do you have a comments form that people can fill in, whether it's QR code or a kind of physical book that people can complete? Are you already running a survey that's got open comments in it? If you're an MPO or something, are you having to collect visitor surveys for that, and you could just bring this in? This might, there's a lot there. This might leave you with a lot to go through, and you might be time limited. Completely understand that. Is it a project that those of you who are lucky enough to have volunteers could ask for their help with, to kind of sift through this and start to look at some of the words people use and the emotions people talk about when they mention the museum and when they talk about their visit? Either way, whether you've got volunteers or not, or whether you've got other resources you can use or not, you don't necessarily need to look at every single item. a good starting point would be to randomly select 50 TripAdvisor reviews, for instance. You make sure it's random, don't pick the ones that, you know, are obviously going to feed into what you want. If you just pick them at random and just have a look at the words that are used, pick out the emotions, and then see if they're linked to any feelings. This isn't about spending, you know, huge amounts of time and money. It's about giving you a sense of, is what is coming out of what external people are saying aligned with what you thought they might say and experience at the last stage when you thought about it from yourself? Is there a gap there? In terms of if you did want some feedback, there's a couple of kind of quick win approaches. If it's something you're keen to engage in a bit more. So Microsoft Forms is free if you have Teams on Office 365, and you can design a really quick survey on there. You can specifically ask for stories that best describe your site on social media, those types of things. And again, just look at the words people use. Where there is resource available, you could choose to engage visitors with a couple of quick questions. So on the slide at the moment is an example of a really quick approach. You could deliver that digitally, you could deliver it on paper, obviously think about the environmental impact of that. But if it's just, you know, asking people what they actually felt, think about the emotions you want to generate, and they can be changed on the outside. It is worth saying that some very similar questions to this have recently been used in the evaluation of Unboxed, for those who are aware of Unboxed. There's definitely a precedent for asking this type of question, so we're not suggesting something here that's, you know, way left field or anything like that. It doesn't have to be in the shape of a star either, it could just be statements. If you have the chance to speak to people, you know, qualitatively, or at the end of outreach events, those types of things, or learning events, or just tours, interactions, those types of things, you could be a bit more playful. So just some examples, you know, if your museum had a favourite song, what would it be? What would be a good dating profile bio for this museum? Those types of things. You don't have to be super serious about it. We're just trying to elicit feedback from people that gives a sense of perceptions that's hopefully going to give, you know, emotions and about their experience, rather than I was very satisfied or I would recommend this to a friend. It's the why, it's the next stage down we're trying to get to. Again, I've represented this in a fairly kind of uninspiring grid, but there's no reason you couldn't ask these as individual questions on Twitter or Facebook, or you could you could even integrate them into an exhibit or an interactive, those types of things. And if all else fails, you can just kind of catch people on the way out, you know, ask them, how did today make you feel? Potentially, you might want to give them this as, you know, a piece of paper, or give them somewhere to answer that question away from you, just so they give you, you know, their actual feedback. It's quite difficult to give the truth when you've been asked by an interviewer and they're stood over you. But, you know, questions like this that are quite open are potentially going to be really useful. Doing any of these activities or any similar ideas you can come up with will also allow you to track how any campaigns and any programming you choose to kind of use this modelling in the future are, whether they're being effective or not as well. So you should potentially see a change in the responses over time if it's working. So what is working, I guess? So that's a bit about figuring out where you are currently. But what if we want to move the dial or provoke a reaction? So as part of this report, we put together a multi-step approach to launching emotionally resonant campaigns. We designed it to be quite broad in scope, so that the same process could be applied to any sort of campaign for support, whether that's crowdfunding, petition, publicity, whether it's something as simple as try to increase cash donations throughout your museum, or as part of the ticket buying process, anything like that. The first step of this is to think about who you need to target and why. So choose an audience for your campaign who you know are likely to be open to your messages. You might choose to target people demographically, by age or location, or by their motivation for engaging in the museum, for example, their local families, or people from across the UK with a particular interest in, you know, whatever subject matter your museum focuses on. And when choosing your target audience, bear in mind the list of emotions you've brainstormed and any of that audience research you did to confirm this. Are there any audiences who could be a quick win for your campaign, for whom one particular emotion resonates especially strongly? Then we would suggest you do list your rational kind of practical reasons for why the public should support you. So take emotions out of the equation. Why practically does your museum need support from the public? What's in it for you? What's in it for them? Who might the campaign benefit? Why do it now and not in the future? What will happen if they don't support you? And finally, once you've identified your target audience and the rational arguments for your support, consider which emotions you can play on that will supercharge that case. So again, paying particular attention to target audience. So imagine, for example, that your museum needs to raise funds to help with energy costs. Consider how evoking different emotions might produce different results. So if you're looking to evoke nostalgia, so you might have a slightly older target audience who maybe visited as kids and then haven't come back, or you want them to support and they do come back. If you evoke nostalgia, you could invite people to recall what their first childhood school trip meant to them or their first visit. And then how would their children feel if they didn't have the same opportunity? If you want to evoke pride, how people would feel if the story of their local history was lost. What about the loss of a significant local landmark? If you were looking to evoke hope, perhaps the museum played an integral part in mobilising support during the pandemic. It showed what was possible when communities come together to support one another. How can audiences help museums support us now in our time of need? We were there for the community. If we all pull together, we can get through this. Evoke hope and ownership. You can emphasise how the museum belongs to the town or to the local place you're based in, a space for people who need inspiration or relaxation or knowledge or just a good day out. The power to retain this resource is in people's hands. It's about that kind of ownership. So as an example of this, of using emotions to develop, this is to develop connection. An example would be the Yemen Inside a Crisis exhibition, which ran at IWM North it was May 2019 to January 2020. And this used a campaign that linked people to those in Yemen, millions of whom were and still are actually suffering from extreme hunger. The slogan "Price of War" was designed so as to initially read as "Price War" and challenge people to think how they'd feel if they too were faced with paying £20 for a box of eggs in the local supermarket. I realise that in 2023 we're probably not that far away from that at this point, but at the time, £20 for a box of eggs in the supermarket. IWM installed an unaffordable vending machine in Manchester Piccadilly train station. And while the campaign initially prompts, emotions around shock, surprise, potentially pity and empathy, by centering the whole creative around a fundamental human need that unites us all, being food, the campaign actually makes people feel connected to fellow human beings, regardless of place, nationality or time period, arguably, but certainly making them think more about the situation in Yemen, and it drove visits to the exhibition. Another example, much more recent. So this is from the Cardiff Civic Society. The extent to which this exact petition was one that helped, the positive result for Cardiff Museum recently, I don't know and can't comment on, but it does serve as a good example of the use of a combined rational and emotional argument. So I've listed here a few examples, but you can see that the things underlined in red are the more rational arguments. So services provided locally, providing social and learning opportunities for children, the potential for the closure to damage relationships with funders in both the short and long term, etc. And then the bits in blue are the more emotionally charged elements. So links to communities, which chimes with ownership and connection, pride, letting down those who have given objects and time in the past, duty as well as pride there really. Feelings of nostalgia or remembered awe, I've called it, for those who've seen the tiled corridor, and a duty to protect that going forward for future generations, and just the pride in the city of Cardiff, which is relevant to all those living in Cardiff. The last point here is an interesting one from the research. There were a lot of examples, particularly from those working in museums, of people who had supported local museums who had never really set foot in them. The connections museums have to their local area is often really strong, I'm sure you know this, but is often only utilised at the point it's going to be lost. because the museum then becomes something to be lost from the place. So I guess part of what we're trying to do here is to bridge that gap, really. Can we make the museum be more relevant to everyone in the place more of the time? The second really interesting takeaway from this example is the use of personification. So we definitely found a theme around the fact that people stir emotions in us, in audiences, in a different way to how objects and inanimate things do. So here it's quite subtle. So it talks about the museum as having a home. But there are examples of museums who've definitely done this successfully and more openly, obviously. So by personifying something inanimate, so the obvious ones are things like the Horniman Walrus or Dippy. That's one way. Or for those who don't have access to dinosaurs or whales or walruses, by crafting a distinct personality for your museum through tone of voice, museums can readily connect with supporters because they come across as more personal than a faceless institution. I think there's a lot of examples of this, but one I like is the Black Country Living Museum. It's really great at having this consistent tone on TikTok. Theirs is quite sassy, but the reaction it brings when they post it again after a bit of a hiatus is similar to how people would greet an old friend. So the bits I've kind of highlighted in yellow are their people's responses to this kind of first TikTok tweet. I'm not on TikTok, I'm 32, but Tok, I don't know, so for a while. You know, I've missed you is something you'd say to someone you have a friendship with. You can't be friends with buildings or learning outcomes. And it might only be because the TikTok videos gave them pleasure, but that's a starting point and a chance to build connection and for a proportion to align with their purpose. The other way to effectively personify your museum is to use staff and volunteers and communities to speak on your behalf. So if museums are campaigning, hearing the opinions and requests for help from individuals who work there or volunteer there or benefit from the museums, definitely made a difference in people choosing whether to extend their support. And that's, you know, talking about campaigns for support when museums need, you know, financial help, as happened in the pandemic. But more generally, in this research, we tested some video examples, and the general feedback was that people don't particularly want you to wheel out the museum director if you're telling them, you know, why the museum is so important. Ask a volunteer, ask someone from the community, someone who looks like them and that they can connect with more readily. So that's campaigns. And how might we kind of use this framework in programming? We've talked a little bit about campaigns, like I said, but actually what we want to do is try and bring some of these emotional connections into programming. Evoking pleasure is something that many museums do well and that the majority of audiences feel on visits. It's about delivering a good day out, however that's defined. So I'm going to focus in this section really on connection for some of the case studies. As museums and the sector move from being more passive displayers of artifacts to being more active, you know, conveners of debate and discussion, reflectors of stories and experiences, connecting people provides a real emotional benefit and is one that came out really strongly in the research. But before we go on to some case studies, just some quick examples of just some practical kind of provocations for how you might integrate some of these emotions into programming. For reference, pages 20 to 28 in the report have more detailed discussion of this, of how to build these in, and there are typically, you know, more than one approach for each emotion. But some of these I've just captured here. So looking at excitement, one way to this is to create anticipation. So to build the emotion of excitement, you need to look to try and create anticipation. A potential way to do that would be, can you build anticipation around a new program that's coming through? You market through word of mouth. For curiosity, can you create a mystery to solve via, you know, a mystery project or a campaign, via a secret trail, or that type of thing? Or really interesting. So one is definitely the size and scale of buildings. So, you know, NHM, the Natural History Museum, got mentioned a lot in terms of, oh, you've got Hope, the whale and things like that. But also tiny things. It's not just about the big things, tiny things would work, but also aim to surprise visitors, so challenge what they think they know about the world, you know, really kind of surprising facts or learnings can generate awe in audiences. Belonging, providing people with their own spaces, this came out really strongly. Can we provide dedicated areas in museums where community groups can programme? Another example was a museum who had provided a very defined area for volunteers. It was the volunteer kitchen kind of thing essentially, but the volunteers really took ownership on that, and that made them recommend it to others, and they were kind of getting the snowball of volunteers going just from providing people their own space and really making them feel like they belonged. And you can do this metaphorically as well as physically, so you can provide people with their own space through having dialogues with them and co-creation and collaboration in terms of developing exhibitions and exhibits, those types of things. Ownership, contemporary collecting was a good example here. So telling the stories of current audiences to kind of marry the past, the present and the future. Nostalgia, some really interesting examples of this, but using kind of multi-sensory approaches. So the sights, the sounds, smells of the past. I think, again, the Black Country Live Museum does this quite well. But also you can remind people of their first visit to the museum by referencing those. So that could be in campaigns as well as programming. Can you tell us about, the first sights you saw when you arrived at the museum, the smells, what does thinking of the museum remind you of, those types of things. And hope, looking to the future. So hope's a forward-facing emotion. What role might museums play in the community moving forward? Can we show how people have overcome tough times and will do so again, therefore. So I said I'm going to focus in on connection in some of the examples. So one approach to do this can definitely be to focus on the familiar. So earlier I talked about the Imperial War Museum, which had used food as the familiar connecting element in their campaign. Creswell Crags is another example. So Creswell Crags tells the story of Ice Age residents of a gorge on the border of Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire. In their exhibition and their wider programming, they discuss the use of familiar items, so gaming boards, combs, those types of things, but also the link to the familiar appreciation of art as a kind of non-practical pursuit. So via both the cave paintings within their gorgeous caves and through items on displays. They've got kind of a carved bone showing a stag. What I mean by non-practical is people did art in the Ice Age, even at a point when really, you might have been better spending your time hunting, that type of thing. Art is not a modern pursuit, I guess, and that's the connection they made. The connection is also to, the deep past, so ancestors, and the more recent past, so the kind of white text below art of our ancestors, invoking nostalgia for any local people who were there when the discovery of the rock art was made 2 decades ago. There's also coverage of sex and love, of migration, of climate change, all of which remain relevant to audiences today and help connect us to those from the past, and to feel connected, to ourselves. Where did my ancestors migrate from? But also connections that we have with other people. So migration, it's not a difficult jump to think about the people crossing the channel on small boats. People will have crossed the channel, be it frozen, to get to England in the Ice Age, those types of things. Connection doesn't always have to be linked to physical artifacts, however. So the Museum of Broken Relationships is in Zagreb, was mentioned by one of our community participants as her favourite museum, and particularly played on the emotion of nostalgia. This museum is a crowdsourced collection of stories, physical and digital, happy and sad stories of relationships that have ended. They're taken from all over the world. The ones I've included here are probably the ones with the least offensive captions, but you can imagine, and if you Google, you can kind of have a look for yourself. I think with this, simultaneously, the museum reminds people of the experience, whilst also reminding that they're not alone of the experience. So you have that brilliant kind of combination of connection and nostalgia. This is a really good way to build connection between the people in the museum also, because a little piece of you or your life becomes part of, the exhibition becomes part of a wider thing. I don't know if anyone, so related to this similar, I don't know if anyone saw the Museum of Me as part of the Birmingham 2022 kind of Commonwealth Games cultural programme, a bit wordy. But that was a great idea that really played on the extreme of this concept, really. So the Museum of Me hosted a day-long museum about, I think it was about 20 different individuals across 2 or 3 weeks. They're just normal people, and they created a museum that was just, you know, their toaster or their shoes or a medal from a sports day that was, you know, important to them. And they had, you know, a grand opening each day and that type of thing. An extreme example, and one you might not be able to replicate, but it really worked, and people really did connect with it, audiences as well as the actual people who were being the subject of the museum. But you don't, you know, taking that, you don't have to focus an entire museum on having people contribute stuff in order to build connection. So another simple but great example is the European Solidarity Centre in Gdansk. I wasn't actually aware before visiting, so for those who need it, the Solidarity movement in Poland was essentially a trade union movement which strived for civil liberty using civil resistance during the 80s. Their leader got our Nobel Peace Prize, and they contributed to bringing the end of communism. That's a very potted history, and it's a very emotive subject that thousands of academics have written on, and I apologise to them all. But for our purposes, I would say this is an example of a museum that does emotion really well, particularly connection. There's a lot of multimedia. Much of it's made up of footage of actual people, of interviews from the time and news footage from the time. There's a lot of interactives. It's very well done. You learn a lot whilst very much enjoying it, and it's very story driven. It's set up across several floors and takes a couple of hours to go around. But the final gallery is made up of thousands and thousands of these individual handwritten notes, each created and hung by a visitor. The subject matter of the museum is very interesting, but potentially not that well known. Hence, I gave them a little bit of spiel up front. And so, whilst a lot of these are definitely related to memories of the events in Poland from the time, you know, and from visitors' perspectives who were there, many are actually about how the people who have visited since have what they've seen and learned, and how this has made them think about the present world. So these pictures are actually mine, and I visited when Trump was running for the first time. There were a lot of messages about how people had, you know, fought for freedom and the end of tyranny, and potentially a perception that I might be returning. People drawing very clear parallels between then and now. I think you can see kind of a never Trump one underlined on the left image about halfway up. So again, there you have this opportunity to contribute to the collection, to feel that belonging as being part of something, to feel that belonging, sorry, as being part of something bigger, and that there are thousands of other people who've stood in the same spot and written something and hung it up and then stepped back. And you see the image in its entirety. So this is the logo of the Solidarity movement, just for reference. And really the whole visit, all of the different exhibition spaces, has been kind of leading up to this idea that individuals can make change. And that when people work together to achieve positive change, they become more than the sum of their parts. And that's then reflected in this quite simple but just really powerful kind of final exhibition room. And it's not, I mean, I definitely felt, you know, probably more connected to people from across the world than I've had before having seen this. And that's why I've put it in here. But it's certainly not just me. I won't read these out to you, but you know, there are people talking about, you know, the emotional roller coaster you go through, quite emotional reading about all that type of thing. You know, they were clearly quite impacted by it, and it does show you that it's possible to build connection between people from completely different cultures and backgrounds, speaking different languages and visiting years apart from each other potentially, and you know, years apart in age. And as a museum, being the curator of that, is gonna breed connection and positivity towards you. Right. Finally, I've not talked much about purpose, but so a very quick note on it. This is the most difficult group of emotions to generate at scale, because where connection can utilize commonalities, and you can connect people with museums, with others, with their communities, with their past, making someone feel a purposeful connection to a museum in the long term really needs you to tap into and align with kind of people's deep-seated beliefs and emotions. Obviously, these can be very different across different people, and this is why we have different political parties. It's why we have animal rights movements, debates about gun control and abortion in the US, and myriad other smaller debates. So I would argue that the first point about purpose, and this is why the quote from Nick Merriman's there, is that you need to be willing to put your organisation out there in terms of what you believe and what you value. The words we use in the report demonstrate the value of your collections in advocating for a better world. Well, a better world is a subjective thought, and I think to really effectively connect with purpose, you have to be willing to risk potentially alienating some audiences, because it's very difficult to be every belief to everyone. At the moment, the organisations who seem to be doing purpose really well are often those who are linked to big issues and that a lot of people can get behind effectively. So the two that sprung to mind for me are the Horniman and Natural History Museum, both of whom are really kind of standing out on the climate change agenda, and particularly for the Horniman, things like repatriation, those types of things. But the other example and one from our research is a much smaller one. This is the Skylark 9 Recovery Trust up in Scotland. For background, the Skylark is a boat that was involved in recovering sailors from Dunkirk in 1940, and then was itself later recovered in 2012. I think it was going to be scrapped. It's now the focal piece of a community recovery project which focuses on working with individuals with a history of substance abuse. So there's kind of saving people from the beach, and the boat was saved, and now people are saving themselves effectively. It's a nice kind of narrative. Given the history of the boat, there are clear parallels that can be drawn around recovery that would inspire hope. There's a sense of fulfillment for audiences that comes from being involved in the restoration of Skylark. There's pride in the impact that it's having on audiences, on those involved directly and on the wider community. All of those emotions are typically things that would support feelings of purpose. However, it is really telling that there's a very clear purpose here, which is bigger than the boat. This is taken directly from their website. It's in pretty big text. They really shout about their vision and their values. And the findings of this study, our findings around purpose in particular, really suggest that museums need to work on clearly communicating the purpose they serve in both their local community and in society. While many museums definitely already have social action initiatives or contribute in powerful ways to the communities, awareness of this purpose-driven action can often be quite low. So if you're not already, do consider shouting about your values and being more upfront about them. And if you're not sure what your values are, potentially consider thinking about whether aligning your organisation to some sort of purpose-driven agenda would make sense. So that has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Just to kind of finish off, really, so I know that was a snapshot. I hope it's given you enough of a flavour to make reading or at least skimming the report seem worthwhile. There are a number of different routes within that report. We've laid them out, and they're outlined near the start. So depending on what you're most interested in, it may be that you can just kind of dip in and read the bits that are most relevant to you. We're also going to be at the AIM conference, so in June, talking about this a bit more, and potentially, hopefully, with a special guest there as well. That's to be confirmed. And moving forward, really, I said at the start, this is a framework to help people think about this more. We're really keen to understand if and how you're putting this to use and how effective it's been. I think Lucy and Matt from Art Fund and AIM are going to provide some mechanism to do that at some point in the future, and that'll be communicated at the time. But I'll stop sharing now and open up to any questions.
Brilliant, thanks so much, Elliot. So as you said, the floor is open for questions. So